Thank you very much for the welcome and for the opportunity to share with you some thoughts. And when I was invited to come to this conference, it was suggested that I look at what Bullinger had to say about the Lord's Supper in his Exegesis 1 Corinthians 11, and then to look at some of his later works to see if there might be some change in his thought or understanding. So I've given you a relatively full outline, and I don't plan to read it. I plan to summarize some things and then finish in good time, so there's time for questions and discussion. So I'll begin with some introduction, something about the commentary 1 Corinthians, and then look at key areas of the commentary that deal with the Lord's Supper, chapter 10, 1 to 5, chapter 10, 15 to 17, chapter 11, 23 to 26, and chapter 11, 27 to 32. And because Bullinger used a work by Ratronus of Corby, I've got a little discussion about him, and then at the end I'll try and give some thoughts about to what extent did Bullinger develop his understanding of Eucharist after this commentary. Now we heard a bit about the commentaries of Bullinger a few months ago, particularly his interaction with Zwingli, but his commentaries were a valuable tool, not only in the hands of the pastors, but I believe if it was not his original intention, but eventually they played a role in the development of the Reformation in other parts of the world. And the theme of this conference is about the Zurich Reformation and its development in the world. So I'm going to suggest that possibly, Zwingli's commentary had some connection here. So the English scholar Polly Hart, she noted that the number of Bullinger's histories which appeared in Cambridge's libraries was dwarfed by the number of his biblical commentaries. Now we know that Bullinger was very strong on writing about history, salvation history and so on, but it's noted here that his commentaries at one stage, more of them appeared in Cambridge. Something about the background to Bullinger's discussion of Eucharist in this commentary. During the early period of Bullinger, when he was in Capelle, he wrote 4 works, they're listed here, under point 2. And I discovered in reading Professor Stevens' work in Zwingliana about 10 years ago, comparing 3 confessions of Bullinger. In one of the more obscure footnotes, there's a reference to a letter in 1532, or a work in 1532, that Bullinger wrote to respond to Johann Faber, who was the Bishop of Vienna, and I had a quick look at that article, and it's more a defense of Oecolampadius and Zwingli, not much in terms of exposition, not much in terms of explaining what the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper is about. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the first real work that deals with the Lord's Supper may be the sections in the commentary 1 Corinthians. Yes, in 1528 in De Origine Erroris, he talks about the Eucharist, but again, more from a historical point of view, Pope Innocent and Fourth Lateran Council, and so on. Now, there's a little bit possibly controversial idea that I want to suggest to you here, that based on an entry in Bullinger's Diarium, dated 12th September 1524, and consideration of the extant works of Zwingli and Bullinger, I'm suggesting you it could be concluded that it was actually Bullinger who influenced Zwingli with respect to the theme of the covenant and also understanding of the Lord's Supper, and not the other way around. And there's some bibliography there if you want to chase that up. But I'm going to use that as an assumption because until we jump into the mid-40s, the Verhaftes Bekanntnis, that really is the first serious work that Bullinger writes on the Lord's Supper, and he was prompted to do that because of because of Luther's work and the vitriolic language that Luther used. And in the 2004 conference that was held here, Amy Nelson Bennett, in the collection of those essays, she noted that Bullinger's esteem and desire to uphold Zwingli's reputation made him sound more Zwinglian than he actually was, and that she further concluded about Bullinger's loyalty to Zwingli's reputation, if not precisely to his theology. So that's my theory that I'm suggesting to you, that what we're going to look at in 1 Corinthians possibly is the first time that Bullinger wrote on Corinthians, because he delayed writing on it in deference for Zwingli. The commentary was published in 1534, dedicated to the church in Frankfurt and also to Melander. And in terms of the context, it was sent after a letter that Luther had sent. I haven't got time to look at that letter and read some of the quotations. Luther had used very, very strong language and talked about whoever has such preachers or is deceived by them, let this be a warning for them, as before the devil incarnate himself. The Zurchus also were referred to in terms of a circus juggler who plays tricks under a hat and says and so on. And there's lots more language like this. So this was in Luther's language, and so that is just before Bullinger writes this commentary on 1 Corinthians. So if we look at the preface of the commentary, Bullinger refers to chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, the different parties, the Cephas party, Paul party, the Christ party, and talk about the factions and indirect reference to Luther. We also need to look at the wider context. There was a letter from the Zurich letters addressed to Bucer in December 1534 that came known as the Zurich Confession, and then Zwingli's work that's already been referred to by Luca. Yes, it was written in 1531, but published by Bullinger at the first possible opportunity, 1536, and then, of course, 1536 was the first Helvetic Confession. A little bit was said about Bullinger's commentary writing style, and some questions were asked in other sessions earlier on in this conference. The usual modus operandi of Bullinger was to give, well, first of all, in terms of his commentary, as Peter Hobbits has explained in his work on Pauline epistles, and especially the Epistle to Rome, Bullinger will look at the major message, that is the hypothesis, and then would zoom in sub-messages, and then occasionally there might be an excursus on a particular topic. So Bullinger generally sought to give what he believed the correct exegesis, and then he would support it with citations from the Church Fathers. We had a question earlier on about the Church Fathers. So the order was Bullinger had his idea, and then he would support his idea with certain quotations of Church Fathers or other Christian writers. Korean scholar Sung Yoon Kim, University of California, Berkeley, I think a few years ago, produced a commentary, dissertation on 1 Corinthians. He's meticulously analysed this commentary, and I've got a quotation here. Bullinger uses almost 1, actually 0.8 or 0.8 in German, citation per page, that is 367 times in 447 pages, frequently accumulating several quotations in a row for building up his exegetical argument. This is quite a high ratio in comparison with contemporary commentators such as Melanchthon and Calvin. And Kim further pointed out that Bullinger not only preferred a long quotation from attributed sources, but he also makes a queuing. He lines them all up, just like a machine gun. And Bruce Gordon has argued for the decidedly selective use of patristic citations by Bullinger and the overriding concern to defend Zurich orthodoxy. And it depends, certainly during the 1540s, according to Bruce Gordon, he had a collection of quotations that he would use. And I'm suggesting that maybe what we see, the sections of 1 Corinthians, come to be looked at, we might see such a collection in embryo. You can read the next paragraph about the different fathers that he quotes the most. Let me say something about 1 Corinthians 10. This part of the passage was used to underscore primarily the continuity between the sacraments of the Old Covenant and the New. The Old were not inferior, and he quotes Augustine and so on. And he emphasised a close connection between the sacraments and the Word of God, and the importance of faith in the heart of the believer, and the fellowship that the believer has with God and fellow believers. And I've discovered that Bullinger's writings are deceptively easy. I think many of us are aware of what Bromley said in his volume, which has the works of Zwingli and Bullinger. He praised Zwingli and said Bullinger's works were pedestrian. And on first reading, they may appear to be pedestrian, but when we delve deeper, they're actually quite deep, and we need to read and reread to get what he's trying to say. So I'm suggesting, on rereading Bullinger from this part of the commentary, it may well be that he intended his readers to understand the enigmatic sentence I've quoted above. It's not the church that makes the word, so he's quoting Augustine, then applying it and trying to infer it's not the church that makes the word, nor even the pastors or the priests who proclaim the word, but rather Christ himself. And he also has in this section a He also has in this section an extended quotation from Ratrimus. I'm going to say a bit more about Ratrimus later on, but basically this first quotation from Ratrimus, quite a long quotation, 2 chapters from the book. The purpose of the quotation is to explain the difference between the words image and truth. The second section I'm going to look at briefly, verses 15 to 17, chapter 10. It's basically about the importance of the Eucharist for the fellowship of believers in the body of Christ. And so he has an extended discussion about fellowship, and he puts the Greek word koinonia there because he's basically saying it's difficult to translate this either into Latin or German or whatever language. And trying to say it's the Christian fellowship is special, it's important, and that's what the Eucharist represents. The next part of the commentary is the major part, and this is where we come to the critical editions produced by the Institut here that Luca has been talking about, and we need to thank the people in the Institute for all their hard work in producing these critical editions, because when you look at the critical editions, they give varying readings, they give what happens over time, and we discovered there are 3 extra materials in the 1537 version of this commentary, and we know they're different because the font size or the font is different. In other cases where it's different, it's usually the footnote, but 3 extra pericope. So that should alert us to ask the question, why did Bullinger add these extra pericope? Well, the first one highlights what it means for the sacrament of the Eucharist to be a symbol for those who have faith. So it's talking about the purpose of symbol, but it's only a symbol for those who have faith, for the fideles, for the credentes. In other words, for the elect. And then the second additional pericope is about the significance of the incarnation, and it later debates the importance of the incarnation, or the understanding of the incarnation, or the application of what the incarnation means to the sacrament is important. That's why it's there. And then the third pericope is about the term Eucharistia. So I don't know the historical background. Maybe there was some issue about the term. If you live in Australia, different parts of Australia, you have to be careful about which terms you use. I'll give you a non-serious example. what you wear when you go to the swimming pool. You might wear cozies, you might wear bathers, you might wear swimmers. So in different parts, you might wear different things. But imagine in theological talk, if you use a term that makes people's ears tingle in another context, then you should avoid that word. Well, maybe Eucharistia, in some contexts, was a word that made people's ears tingle, and maybe that's why Zwingli added this extra pericope to affirm that it's a correct word, because the Eucharist was also a part of sacrifice of thanksgiving, praise and thanksgiving from Hebrews chapter 13. And very clearly in this passage, Bullinger refers to ad fontes. This is seen from his citation letter to Cyprian's letter to Pompeius. In other words, it's not the church or the tradition of the church that's the origin, but Christ himself. And this same point is hammered out in much greater detail in the 1528 edition of his, had already been in the 1528 edition of De Origine Erroris. Now, if we take the time to look at the words that Bullinger uses, we find that in this section of the commentary, I've only done the study in this section of the commentary, the words for remembrance, memoria and memoracula, I've given the numbers, I think, footnote 21, memoria 4 times, memoracula 11 times, and it could mean that he's trying to say that, well, going back to Luca's presentation a few moments ago, both he and Zwingli have the right understanding of the original Greek word anamnesis, and it's not just memory in the past, but memory with another nuance, but not the concept of memory, which means a re-sacrifice of Christ, which in some contexts, that's what this term meant. And then in this section, Bullinger has a discussion on the covenantal aspect of the Eucharist, and there's a deliberate parallel syntactically made between hoc est corpus meum and hoc est testamentum. I think this was referred to somebody else in one of the earlier speeches, but the hoc est testamentum comes from Exodus 24. This is the Passover of the Lord, or this is the covenant of the Lord. And it's a covenant renewal ceremony in Exodus, or a covenant sealing ceremony. So, first of all, from a syntactical point of view, Bullinger is saying you don't interpret the est, the word, the copula, in a literal form, but he's also trying to see the parallel, or to underline the parallel with the Passover in the Old Testament. And he also refers to the eternal covenant, that the Eucharist is a symbol of eternal covenant. These are actually not Bullinger's words, it's a quotation from Erasmus, but I was trying to suggest earlier on that quite often Bullinger uses others to say that what he wants to say. So it's effectively Bullinger's word. And it's in the same context, he talks about nova lex. And, well, I have a theory that the Torah of Christ replaces the Torah of the Old Testament. And I think we see this here in embryo. And just as Luke was saying earlier on, there's quite a long quotation from Zwingli's Christiana Fide, but also from the Corvitius Ecce, and also from Ocolopalius' Dialogus. And they're quite long quotations, and I think it's to affirm that what Ocolopalius and Zwingli wrote about the Lord's Supper, he agrees with and he affirms, and also affirms them as reformers. But the quotation from Christiana Fide is important because this is the section where Zwingli talks about the role of the senses, and that the senses is born to strengthen faith, but only when placed under the obedience of faith, and that when believers take place, they have in the Eucharist, they have a heightened understanding of the sacrament as a thanksgiving and a perpetual memory and pleasure of God's love for the elect So the concept of the elect or true believers is emphasized again and again. And then there's another quotation from Rattramus where the term mysterium was used. We know that mysterium is the Latinized version of the Greek word and taken over by sacramentum. But the point is that the benefit of the Eucharist is given to the believer sub figura, not literally. And so that's why it's this. So I'll say something about Rattramus in just a moment. And then the last passage we'll look at is chapter 11, 27 to 32. Now these terms are not actually used in this section. That is the ipi, that is the unrighteous or the unworthy. And we know that in later years this becomes a big debate. What do the unrighteous receive in the Eucharist? What the unworthy receive? And he's addressing this, and he cites Augustine's tractate on John's Gospel to point out that those with the right attitude receive the benefits of the sacrament. The fact that there are benefits to receive reinforces what he said several times, that they are not bare sacraments. It's not bare remembrance. There are benefits. Well, let me say something about his use of the work by Rattramus in the 9th century, at the request of Charles the Bald. He wrote a work called De Corpore et Sanguine Domini, the same title of a work that was also written by the head monk at the cloister in Corbie, that's northern France, Paisius Robertus. And he was particularly asked by the emperor to look at two questions. The first question, whether the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist were taken in mystery or in truth. And then the second question was whether the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist is the same as that born of Mary. Now, I discovered when I looked at Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologia 375.1, the question is whether the body of Christ is in the sacrament of the Eucharist truly, or only in the figure, or as in the sign. So in terms of the terminology, which also occurs in Rattramus, it was important for Bullinger and the other reformers to correctly understand the terms and the use of those terms. Now, as I think we all know, that Robertus's work became the standard work that was approved by the Church, and in fact in the 10th century or 11th century, Berengar of Tours, he had read Rattramus's work, although he signed to it the name of the author, another name, and of course he was forced to recant. And the book, Rattramus's treatise, was condemned at the Council of Vercelli, and Berengar signed under duress an oath which I'll read for you. The bread and wine which are placed on the altar are after consecration not only a sacrament, but also the true body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. And with the senses, not only sacramentally, not only sacramentally, but in truth are taken and broken by the hands of the priest and crushed by the teeth of the faithful. Now, in one of Norfolk Burnett's recent works, I think it's footnote 33, books Cultivating the Sacraments, Print and Authority in the Early Reformation, published in 2019, she writes, Berengar was portrayed as a hero who taught that Christ's body was contained figuratively and not really and substantially in the sacrament. Now, the work was known by the early 1500s. It reappeared. It was lost for many years, but reappeared. And it was actually used by the Bishop John Fisher of England in a massive tome of about 700 pages to respond to Oikonompartius. But where Zurich is involved is that in 1532, Leo translated this work into German, and it was sent to the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the introduction was penned by Bullinger, and he used this introduction, and I think in the footnote, footnote 34, there's an article by Christian Moser. It's a very good article, quite a long time ago, 2003. In the introduction, penned by Bullinger, he used this opportunity to defend the work of Oikonompartius and also to respond to the invective, the name-calling of Luther. And basically, he's desiring unity for the church to be based on the truth. And I believe in many ways it's the same as his Wahrhaftes Bekenntnis. When he sent his Wahrhaftes Bekenntnis to Luther, he sent it together with Luther's original confession. As if to say, you read what I've written, here's what you have written, you reread the Bible, and come to your senses. And I think he's doing this in embryo, in his introduction to Yod's translation of Ratchness's translation thesis. Now, why was Bullinger drawn to Ratchness? I didn't get much sleep. I'm still. He comes from Australia, so it's tomorrow morning in Australia. Because Ratchness's work forms a bridge back to the Church Fathers. So I've given the names and the dates: Ambrose 340 to 397, Jerome 347 to 420, Augustine 354 to 430, Fulgentius, late 5th century, early 6th century, and Isidore 560 to 636. So the point is, Bullinger is saying, what I am doing is going back to the Bible and giving the correct exegesis. Nothing new. And the exegesis I'm giving, you'll see in these people there's a bridge back if you will only look and compare. I'm not making it up. Who has deviated from the truth? It's the Roman Church. Well, let me quickly say something about whether there are any developments, and we better finish there. Well, I've listed here the main works that Bullinger wrote about the Eucharist. Some were written in special circumstances, and the Consensus Tiguanus has been mentioned in several presentations, and in the bookstore is the book that was edited by Emilio Campion. Pidopoulos has some contribution, and that's a very, very impressive and very thorough work that you need to read, that helps us understand the contextual situation behind Bullinger writing. I've already mentioned the Wahrhaftes Bekenntnis, and I've listed some other works here that where Bullinger talks about the Lord's Supper. And then the second paragraph, top of page 6, I've summarised what Bullinger says in the second Helvetic Confession. I won't read it out, we don't have time. But what I want to draw your attention to is that in the second Helvetic Confession, in chapter 21, he refers to the recantation of Berengar. We therefore, this is I'm reading from the paragraph above the conclusion. We therefore disapprove of that canon in the Pope's decrees, ego Berengarius. And so by negative logic, Bullinger is affirming what Berengar and therefore what Ratchness said. So my point is, I was asked to think of changes, and I thought of two changes that were worth mentioning. One is In his later works, he doesn't seem to refer to righteousness at all. Why is that? Except for this section I read for you from the Second Helvetic Confession book. We haven't got time to discuss it, but eventually righteousness books got off the index of Trent, and I think around about 1900. It's an approved work for the Roman Catholic Church, and Roman Catholic scholars are now reading the work and finding in righteousness's work basis for their view of transubstantiation. And I suspect that throughout the years, Bullinger realised that he agreed with righteousness, so much so that he wanted Cranmer to read it. I haven't got time to talk about that. And he wanted the English performers to read it, and he wanted Vardian and various people to be involved. But I'm suggesting he didn't refer to righteousness directly later on because others were coming with different interpretations, and even though he believed righteousness was correct, methodologically he would not achieve his purpose by citing his name. And the other quick difference that I've noted, and I haven't had time to develop this, in terms of the farms that he uses, he repeats them. You look at the decades, you see a similar pattern, but in some of his later works, he talks about the work of Theodoret of Syros, and I think it's because he's fine-tuning his understanding of the incarnation, because he realizes the correct understanding of what it means for Christ to be both God and man, and what happens when he dies. He's descended to hell, and with his glorified body he ascends and sits at the right hand of heaven. How do you understand this? And I believe both he and Vernon Italy were using Theodoret. Well, just by way of conclusion, Bullinger believed, and this is expressed in his 1 Corinthians commentary, that his exegesis of these passages demonstrate that his biblical theological understanding of the Eucharist was the same as that of the early church or the primitive church, and that's why he has this chain of citation of church fathers, particularly Augustine, and talk a bit about his quotations from Retrogramus. And he's basically saying that the church needs to return to its original roots. And I haven't done a detailed study, but if you look at his earlier works, I've mentioned this before at the beginning, De Institut Eucharistiae, 1525, and you compare this with his later works, I believe there appear to be minimal developments. There may be differences, nuances, but no major developments. Thank you very much for listening.